Before we dive into today's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching new listeners and keeping these stories coming. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It reminds us that these stories connect people across continents and time zones. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing means we can keep bringing you these deep dives into history's darkest corners. Now, let's get into it. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. The sky is clear. The ocean is calm. You're stationed at one of the most beautiful military installations in the world, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's December 7th, 1941. For most sailors and soldiers, it's a day of rest. Some are writing letters home, others are eating breakfast in mess halls or preparing for church services. The ships sit in neat rows along Battleship Row, their steel hulls gleaming in the early light. Seaman First Class James Miller stands on the deck of the USS Oklahoma, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. He's thinking about his girl back in Kansas. He promised her he'd be home for Christmas next year. The war in Europe feels distant, irrelevant. This is paradise. This is safety. In the galley of the USS Arizona, cooks are preparing breakfast for a crew of 1,500 men. The smell of bacon and coffee fills the air. Men joke and laugh. Someone hums a tune from the radio. Sunday morning, the best morning of the week. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel sleep in. The hangar doors are open. Rows of fighters and bombers sit parked wing to wing neatly, arranged for easy security. No one expects trouble. No one is on alert. Then, at 7:55 in the morning, the world explodes. The sound comes first. A distant droning that grows louder, closer, until it becomes a roar that shakes the ground. Sailors look up. They see formations of aircraft approaching from the north. Some wave, thinking they're American planes on a training exercise. Then they see the red circles on the wings, the rising sun. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft scream out of the sky. Bombs tear through the decks of battleships. Torpedoes slice through the water and rip open hulls below the waterline. Machine gun fire rakes across airfields, destroying planes before they can even take off. Within 2 hours, more than 2,000 Americans are dead. The Pacific Fleet is crippled, and the United States is suddenly, irrevocably, at war. James Miller never makes it home for Christmas. He drowns in the capsized hull of the Oklahoma, trapped in darkness as the water rises around him, and 500 other men. The cooks on the Arizona never serve that breakfast. The ship explodes with such force that parts of her superstructure are found half a mile away. Most of the crew dies instantly. Those who don't burn. For generations, Pearl Harbor has been remembered as a day of infamy. A surprise attack that pulled America into the Second World War. But underneath the official narrative, a darker question has lingered for more than 80 years. Was Pearl Harbor really a surprise? Or was it a warning that leadership chose not to act on? Some believe the attack could have been prevented. Others go further, suggesting that those in power may have allowed it to happen because they needed it to happen. They needed a catalyst powerful enough to unite a divided nation and justify entry into a global conflict. Tonight, we're going to walk through the intelligence, the warnings, the decisions, and the silences that preceded one of the most devastating days in American history. We'll examine what was known, when it was known, and who knew it. We'll hear from the men who saw the signs and tried to sound the alarm. We'll trace the chain of command from radar stations to the highest levels of government. And by the end, you'll be left with a question that refuses to go away. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming, or because someone chose not to look? This is the story of the warning that was ignored. Chapter 1. A Nation Divided About War. To understand what happened at Pearl Harbor, you first need to understand the America that existed before December the 7th, 1941, This was not a nation eager for war. In fact, it was a nation desperate to avoid it. The memories of the First World War still lingered like ghosts. Millions of men had been sent overseas to fight in trenches, to die in mud and poison gas, in a conflict many Americans believed had nothing to do with them. Mothers had waved goodbye to sons who never came home. Entire towns had lost their young men to European battlefields that most Americans couldn't find on a map. When the war ended in 1918, the United States retreated inward. Isolationism became the dominant political philosophy. The message was clear. America would stay out of Europe's problems. It would protect its own borders and let the rest of the world solve its own conflicts. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was rejected by the American Senate. The ocean was wide, the homeland was safe. Never again would American blood be spilled in foreign wars. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again descending into chaos. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, preaching racial supremacy and territorial expansion. Fascism was spreading across Italy under Benito Mussolini. Spain had collapsed into civil war, and in Asia, Japan was carving out an empire through brutal military conquest. And yet, despite the growing darkness, most Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign war. Polls conducted throughout 1939 and 1940 showed that more than 80% of the population opposed direct involvement in European conflicts. The America First Committee, led by prominent figures including aviator Charles Lindbergh, held massive rallies arguing that intervention would be a disaster. Mothers who had lost sons in the First World War formed groups demanding neutrality. Politicians campaigned on promises to keep American boys out of foreign trenches. The isolationist movement was powerful, vocal, and widespread. It crossed party lines. It united urban intellectuals and rural farmers. It reflected a deep conviction that the problems of other continents were not America's responsibility. But not everyone agreed. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the threat differently. He believed that fascism and militarism were not just Europe's problem, they were humanity's problem. He understood that if the Axis powers were allowed to dominate Europe and Asia, the security of the United States itself would eventually be at risk. He had watched Hitler's rise with growing alarm. He had read reports of atrocities in China. He had met with Winston Churchill and heard first-hand accounts of Britain's desperate struggle for survival. Roosevelt believed that American involvement was not just likely, it was necessary. But Roosevelt also understood that he could not drag a reluctant nation into war. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war. Congress would not act without public support, and public opinion was overwhelmingly against intervention. This created a political dilemma that would define the final years before Pearl Harbor. How do you prepare a nation for a war it does not want? Roosevelt began walking a tightrope. Publicly, he reassured Americans that he would keep them out of war. In his 1940 campaign for an unprecedented third term, he promised parents, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." The crowds cheered. He won the election. Privately, he worked to support Britain and China through programs like Lend-Lease, supplying weapons and resources without committing troops. The policy was sold as a way to stay out of war by helping others fight in America's place. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt declared in a fireside chat. But critics saw it differently. They argued that Lend-Lease was a backdoor to intervention, that supplying one side in a war meant taking sides, and that taking sides meant eventual involvement. Roosevelt strengthened the military. He expanded intelligence operations. He positioned naval forces in strategic locations. He did everything he could to prepare the United States for the conflict he believed was inevitable. But he could not declare war without Congress. And Congress would not declare war without public support. And public support would not materialize unless something changed. Something dramatic. Something personal. Something that made the threat undeniable. In the White House, conversations took place behind closed doors. Advisors debated strategy. Intelligence officials briefed the president on global developments. And the question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. What would it take to change the public's mind? This is where the conspiracy theory begins. Some historians and researchers believe that Roosevelt, and others in his administration, recognized that only a direct attack on American soil would be enough to unite the country. They suggest that Pearl Harbor was not simply a failure of intelligence or preparedness. They suggest it was an event that certain leaders were willing to allow because the alternative, remaining neutral while the world burned, was worse. To be clear, this is not proven. There is no document where Roosevelt writes, "Let them attack." There is no recording of a cabinet meeting where the decision is made. The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, intelligence that was not acted upon, and outcomes that aligned perfectly with strategic needs. But the question persists because the political context makes it plausible. When a leader is trapped between what they believe must be done and what the public will accept, how far might they go to bridge that gap? Would Roosevelt have risked American lives to save more lives in the long run? Would he have allowed a tragedy to prevent a greater one? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront. By late 1941, Roosevelt and his advisors knew that war with Japan was likely. Tensions had been escalating for years. Economic pressure was mounting. Diplomatic relations were deteriorating. The question was not whether conflict would come, but when and how. And in that space between inevitability and action, some believe a decision was made, not to start a war, but to let one start. In the halls of power, the calculations were cold. 2,000 lives versus 200,000. A crippled fleet versus a united nation. Short-term catastrophe versus long-term survival. If the conspiracy theory is true, then Pearl Harbor was not an attack that caught America by surprise. It was an attack that America allowed to happen. And the men who died that morning were not victims of Japanese aggression alone. They were sacrifices on the altar of strategy. Chapter 2: Rising Tensions with Japan. Japan in the 1930s was a nation transformed by ambition and desperation. After centuries of isolation, Japan had rapidly industrialized and modernized. It had built a powerful military, it had developed an empire, but it also faced a critical problem that would drive its actions for the next decade: resources. Japan is a small island nation with limited natural resources. It has little oil, limited steel, almost no rubber. To sustain its military and its growing population, it needed raw materials that it did not have, and the only way to get them was to take them from somewhere else. The solution, in the eyes of Japanese leadership, was expansion. Throughout the 1930s, Japan invaded and occupied large portions of China. The conquest was brutal. Cities were destroyed. Civilians were massacred. The world watched in horror as reports emerged from places like Nanking, where Japanese soldiers committed atrocities that shocked even hardened diplomats. Japan established puppet governments in occupied territories. It seized control of regions rich in resources. It justified its actions with rhetoric about creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a bloc of Asian nations free from Western colonialism, led by Japan. The League of Nations condemned these actions. So did the United States. But condemnation without enforcement meant nothing. Japan continued its expansion unchecked, confident that the Western powers were too distracted by their own problems to intervene. Then the United States intervened, not with troops, but with economics. In 1940, the Roosevelt administration imposed a series of trade restrictions on Japan. First, it was steel and scrap metal, materials essential for building warships and aircraft. Then aviation fuel. Japan could no longer rely on American suppliers to fuel its military machine. The restrictions tightened throughout 1941. In the summer, the United States froze all Japanese assets held in American banks. This was followed by a full oil embargo, the most devastating blow of all. Japan imported more than 80% of its oil from the United States and its allies. Without oil, the Japanese military could not function. Ships would be stranded, aircraft would be grounded, tanks would sit idle, the war machine would grind to a halt within months. From the American perspective, the embargo was a way to pressure Japan into withdrawing from China and ending its aggression without going to war. It was economic warfare, painful but preferable to sending troops. But from the Japanese perspective, it was an existential threat. In Tokyo, military and political leaders gathered in tense meetings. They reviewed stockpiles, they calculated timelines, they debated options. The numbers were stark. Japan had enough oil reserves to sustain operations for approximately 18 months. After that, the military would be paralysed, the empire would collapse, everything they had fought for would be lost. One faction argued for negotiation. Perhaps if Japan made concessions, withdrew from some territories, agreed to certain restrictions, the United States would lift the embargo. War could be avoided. Another faction argued for war. They saw the embargo as proof that the United States would never allow Japan to be a true power. Negotiation was pointless. The only option was to strike first, hard, fast and decisively, before Japan's resources ran out. The debate raged for months, but as summer turned to fall, the balance tipped toward war. The plan that emerged was bold and risky. If conflict with the United States was inevitable, Japan would not wait for its oil reserves to run dry. It would launch a preemptive strike designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. With the Pacific Fleet destroyed, Japan could seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines. By the time the United States rebuilt its fleet, Japan would control enough resources to sustain a long war. And perhaps, faced with the cost of reconquest, America would negotiate a peace that allowed Japan to keep at least some of its gains. The target was chosen, Pearl Harbor. The logic was simple. Pearl Harbor was the home of the Pacific Fleet. If the fleet could be destroyed at anchor, Japan would have months, perhaps years, of freedom to operate without American interference. The plan was unprecedented. No carrier-based strike force had ever attempted an operation at such range. The logistics were staggering, the risks were enormous, but Japanese military planners believed it could work. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, oversaw the planning. Yamamoto was a realist. He had studied at Harvard. He had served in Washington as a naval attaché. He understood American industrial power, and he had serious doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against the United States. But if war was coming, and by the fall of 1941 he believed it was, then the only chance Japan had was to strike first and strike hard. Yamamoto famously told his colleagues, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that I have no confidence." It was not it was boast. It was a warning. Diplomatic talks continued throughout the fall, but they were little more than theatre. Japanese diplomats in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, presenting proposals and counter-proposals. Hull listened politely and rejected them all. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan refused. Both sides knew that the talks were going nowhere, but both sides continued them anyway. Japan to buy time for military preparations, and the United States because Roosevelt had promised to exhaust all diplomatic options before going to war. By late November, the situation had reached a breaking point. American intelligence agencies were watching Japan closely. They knew that Japanese military activity was increasing. They knew that diplomatic relations were deteriorating. They knew that troop movements suggested mobilization for war. But knowing that something is coming is not the same as knowing when or where, and that is where the conspiracy theory finds its foothold. Because if American leaders knew that war with Japan was inevitable, if they understood that the embargo had backed Japan into a corner, then they also knew that an attack was likely. Some researchers argue that this was not an accident. They argue that the embargo was designed to provoke Japan into striking first, giving the United States the moral and political justification to enter the war. The timing supports this interpretation. The embargo was imposed in July 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked in December. That's 5 months, almost exactly the amount of time Japanese planners would need to prepare a major operation. Did Roosevelt know that the embargo would force Japan's hand? Did he understand that economic pressure would lead to military action? And if so, did he accept that risk because he wanted Japan to attack? Again, this is interpretation, not proven fact. But the timeline raises uncomfortable questions. Why impose an embargo so severe that it left Japan with no option but war? Why continue diplomatic talks that both sides knew were pointless? And why leave the Pacific Fleet concentrated in one location, vulnerable and exposed? Some argue that these were reasonable actions taken by a leader trying to deter aggression without starting a war. Others argue that they were calculated moves designed to engineer the exact outcome that occurred. By late November 1941, the pieces were all in place. Japan had committed to war, the United States had drawn its line, and somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a carrier fleet was steaming toward Hawaii in absolute radio silence. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 aircraft, thousands of highly trained pilots and sailors, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, and no one in Hawaii knew they were coming. The question is not whether American leaders knew war was coming, the question is whether they knew where and did nothing. Chapter 3. Intelligence Signals. Before the attack. Intelligence work is often a puzzle with missing pieces. You collect fragments of information, radio intercepts, troop movements, diplomatic cables, reconnaissance reports, and you try to assemble them into a picture. Sometimes the picture is clear, sometimes it is not, and sometimes you only understand what you were looking at after the fact. In the months and weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, American intelligence agencies were collecting a massive volume of data on Japanese activity. They were intercepting Japanese diplomatic communications through a program known as MAGIC. They were monitoring naval movements, they were analysing patterns, they were watching, listening, recording, and they were seeing warning signs. Throughout the fall of 1941, intercepted messages showed that Japan was preparing for something significant. Diplomatic codes indicated that negotiations were failing. Military codes revealed increased activity across the Pacific. Fleet movements suggested mobilization. Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer worked in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. His job was to translate and analyze intercepted Japanese communications. He spent his days hunched over coded messages, working through the tedious process of decryption and interpretation. In late November, the messages became more urgent. On November 19th, Tokyo sent a message to its embassy in Washington. The situation is nearing a crisis. Time is running out. On November 22nd, another message. There are reasons beyond your ability to guess why we want to settle Japanese-American relations by the 25th. Kramer knew what these messages meant. Deadlines in diplomatic communications are never arbitrary. They signal intent. They indicate that decisions have been made, but the messages were not specific. They did not say, "We are going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Instead, they painted a picture of general escalation. Something was coming. But where? The Philippines? Malaya? The Dutch East Indies? All of these were considered more likely targets than Hawaii. Still, there were clues that should have raised alarms. On November 24th, American intelligence intercepted a message from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The message requested detailed information about ship movements in Pearl Harbor, which ships were in port, where they were moored, how many were present. This was unusual. Why would Japan need such specific information about Pearl Harbor unless it was planning an operation there? The message was noted. It was filed. It was not flagged as urgent. 3 days later, another message requested an update. Tokyo wanted to know if the information was still accurate. They wanted current data. Again, the message was intercepted, translated, and filed. No alarm was raised. Then, in late November, American intelligence intercepted a message instructing Japanese diplomats in Washington to destroy their code machines. This was a clear sign that war was imminent. When diplomats destroy code machines, it means they are preparing to cease operations. It means that communication is about to end, and that actions, not words, are coming next. Intelligence officers in Washington recognized the significance immediately. Warnings were sent to military commanders across the Pacific, including those in Hawaii. But the warnings were vague. They emphasized vigilance and readiness, but did not specify a threat. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, non-committal. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. That was the message sent to Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, on November 27th. It told him that war was likely. It told him to be alert, but it did not tell him where the attack would come. It did not identify Pearl Harbor as a potential target. It did not convey urgency beyond the general sense that something might happen soon. Kimmel read the message. He discussed it with his staff, and he concluded that the threat was primarily to American interests in the Western Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. Hawaii seemed too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Then there was the matter of the missing carriers. American intelligence had been tracking the movements of Japanese aircraft carriers throughout the year. Carriers were Japan's most powerful offensive weapons. They were the platform for launching airstrikes across vast distances. If Japan was planning a major operation, the carriers would be central to it. But in late November, the carriers disappeared. One by one, they stopped appearing in radio intercepts. Their locations became unknown. Intelligence analysts lost track of them. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer. He worked directly under Kimmel, providing daily briefings on enemy activity. On December 2nd, Kimmel asked Layton where the Japanese carriers were. Layton had to admit he didn't know. Kimmel pressed, "Do you mean to say they could be rounding Diamond Head and you wouldn't know it?" Layton replied, "I hope they would be sighted before that." It was said as a joke. Neither man believed the carriers were anywhere near Hawaii, but they were. The Japanese strike force, 6 carriers and their escorts, had left the Kurile Islands on November 26th. They steamed eastward across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. They refueled at sea. They avoided shipping lanes. They travelled through some of the most remote waters on Earth. And American intelligence had no idea where they were. Some analysts assumed the carriers were in home waters, preparing for operations in Southeast Asia. Others speculated they might be heading toward the Philippines, but no one seriously considered that they might be heading for Hawaii. Conspiracy theorists point to this moment as critical. They argue that losing track of Japan's most powerful weapons should have triggered alarm bells at the highest levels. They argue that if intelligence agencies could not locate the carriers, the logical assumption should have been that they were preparing for a surprise attack, and that Pearl Harbor, the largest American naval base in the Pacific, was an obvious potential target. But that is hindsight speaking. At the time, most military analysts believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Conventional wisdom held that carriers could not operate effectively at such a distance. The logistics were considered too difficult, the risk too great. Naval officers in Washington ran the calculations. A carrier strike on Pearl Harbor would require Japan to send its fleet nearly 4,000 miles across open ocean, attack a heavily defended base, and then return before running out of fuel. The operation seemed impossible, or at least highly improbable. So even though the carriers were missing, even though tensions were at their peak, even though warnings had been issued, Pearl Harbor was not seen as the most likely target. And yet, some intelligence officers did express concern. Some reports suggested that Hawaii should be on alert. Some analysts noted the possibility of a surprise attack. Were those warnings heard? Were they acted on? Or were they dismissed because they contradicted prevailing assumptions? In late November, a young intelligence analyst named Rufus Bratton was working in the Army's Military Intelligence Division in Washington. He had been reviewing intercepts and was troubled by what he saw. The pattern suggested that Japan was preparing for immediate action. The deadlines were tight. The tone was final. Bratton believed that war could break out within days. He tried to convey this urgency to his superiors. He recommended that Pacific commanders be given more specific warnings. He suggested that reconnaissance flights be increased around Hawaii. His recommendations were acknowledged. but they were not fully implemented. Part of the problem was bureaucracy. Intelligence was compartmentalized. Different agencies collected different types of information and did not always share effectively. The Navy had its intelligence operation. The Army had its own. The State Department had diplomatic channels. The FBI monitored domestic threats. Coordination was poor. Part of the problem was interpretation. The same set of facts could be read in different ways depending on your assumptions. If you believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked, then you interpreted the intelligence to fit that belief. If you believed that Japan would strike closer targets first, then you looked for evidence supporting that conclusion. And part of the problem may have been intent. Because if leaders in Washington wanted Japan to strike first, if they needed a catalyst to bring the nation into war, then the best way to ensure that outcome was to see the warning signs, acknowledge them, and then do just enough to appear vigilant without actually preventing the attack. This is the core of the conspiracy theory. Not that intelligence agencies were incompetent, but that they were following orders to collect information, to file reports, to send warnings that were worded carefully enough to provide cover later, but vague enough to ensure that field commanders did not take decisive action. By early December, American intelligence knew that war was imminent. They knew Japan was planning military operations. They knew the carriers were missing. They knew that diplomatic relations had collapsed. What they did not know, or claimed not to know, was where the blow would fall. And on the scuffed morning of December the 7th, 1941, the world found out. But here's what makes the conspiracy theory so compelling. After the attack, when investigators reviewed the intelligence records, they found that almost every piece of the puzzle had been in place. The warnings had been there, the indicators had been clear, the pattern in retrospect was obvious. The question is not whether the information existed. The question is whether anyone chose to act on it, or whether someone chose not to. Chapter 4. The Broken Chain of Command. Command is a chain. Information flows up, orders flow down, and when that chain breaks, the consequences can be catastrophic. In Hawaii, the chain was fractured long before the first bombs fell. At the top of the Pacific Fleet command structure was Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel. 59 years old, a career naval officer with decades of experience, Kimmel had been appointed to command the Pacific Fleet in February 1941. He was responsible for naval operations across the entire Pacific Ocean, a vast area of water covering millions of square miles. His headquarters were at Pearl Harbor, where the bulk of the fleet was stationed. 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, tens of thousands of sailors. This was the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, and Kimmel was responsible for keeping it safe and ready. But Kimmel faced challenges that went beyond simple military readiness. The Pacific Fleet was in transition. It had only recently been moved from its traditional base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor, a decision made to project American power westward and signal to Japan that the United States would not tolerate further expansion. But Pearl Harbor had limitations as a naval base. Its facilities were still being developed. Its defences were incomplete. And it was closer to potential threats than San Diego had been. Kimmel had requested additional reconnaissance aircraft to patrol the waters around Hawaii. He wanted more submarines to extend his surveillance range. He wanted better intelligence on Japanese movements. Many of his requests were denied or delayed. Resources were prioritised for the Atlantic, where German U-boats were attacking supply convoys to Britain. The Pacific was seen as a lower priority. Kimmel was told to make do with what he had. Still, he did not believe Pearl Harbor was at risk. This was not arrogance. It was a reasonable assessment based on the information he had been given. Intelligence reports emphasized threats to the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The prevailing military wisdom held that Japan would strike at weaker, closer targets before challenging American naval power directly. When Kimmel received the war warning on November 27th, he took it seriously. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed his defensive posture, and he concluded that the threat was to American interests in the Western Pacific, not to Hawaii itself. He increased patrol slightly, he reviewed security procedures, but he did not place the fleet on full alert. Ships continued their normal routines. Sailors went ashore on liberty. Sunday, December the 7th, was scheduled as a day of rest. The army was responsible for the defence of the Hawaiian Islands themselves, including the air bases and installations surrounding Pearl Harbor. That responsibility fell to Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short. 51 years old, a career army officer, Short had taken command of the Hawaiian Department in February 1941, the same month Kimmel arrived. Like Kimmel, Short believed that the greater threat to Hawaii came from sabotage, not external attack. This belief shaped his decisions in profound ways. Hawaii had a large population of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. Some military officials worried that this population could be a security risk, that saboteurs might try to damage aircraft, ships, or facilities if war broke out. Short took these concerns seriously. Throughout late November and early December, Short implemented measures to protect against sabotage. He ordered aircraft parked close together on airfields, where they could be more easily guarded. He increased security at key facilities. He focused on preventing internal threats. What he did not do was disperse the aircraft to make them harder targets in case of air attack. He did not increase air patrols over the surrounding ocean. He did not place his forces on full combat alert. Again, this was not incompetence. It was a decision based on the guidance he had received from Washington. And that guidance was vague. On November 27th, both Kimmel and Short received warning messages from Washington. The Army message to Short read, "Hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense." Read that carefully. The message says that hostile action is possible. It says that Japan should commit the first overt act, meaning the United States should not strike first. But it also says that Short should not let policy jeopardize his defense. It's contradictory. It tells Short to be ready while simultaneously telling him not to do anything that might provoke Japan. Short interpreted this to mean he should focus on preventing sabotage while avoiding actions that might look aggressive, like dispersing aircraft or increasing patrols. He did not want to be blamed for triggering a war through overly aggressive defensive measures. The Navy message to Kimmel was slightly different but equally vague. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. Execute appropriate defensive deployment. Again, the message confirms that war is likely, but it does not specify where the attack might come. It does not identify Pearl Harbor as a target. It does not convey the level of urgency that would justify disrupting normal operations. Kimmel and Short discussed the warnings. They agreed that the situation was serious. They agreed that vigilance was needed. But neither believed that Pearl Harbor was in immediate danger. And here is where the conspiracy theory becomes most pointed. Because the warnings sent to Hawaii were not the only warnings issued. Intelligence reports in Washington painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Messages intercepted from Japanese diplomats indicated that war would begin soon. Analysts had noted the disappearance of the carrier fleet. Some officials in Washington believed that Hawaii could be at risk. But the warnings sent to Kimmel and Short did not reflect that level of concern. Why not? Conspiracy theorists argue that this was intentional. They suggest that the warnings were deliberately softened to avoid triggering defensive measures that might have prevented or mitigated the attack. They point to the fact that Washington had access to intelligence that was not shared with field commanders. They note that higher-level officials understood the strategic picture in ways that Kimmel and Short did not. If the goal was to allow an attack to happen, to create the catalyst needed to bring the nation into war, then the best way to achieve that goal was to keep commanders in Hawaii just informed enough to avoid suspicion, but not informed enough to act effectively. This is speculation, not proof. But it explains a pattern that official investigations struggle to reconcile. How intelligence agencies in Washington could see the threat so clearly, while commanders in Hawaii remained in the dark. Consider the chain of command. Intelligence is collected by field operatives and technical specialists. It is analysed by mid-level officers in various agencies. It is summarised in reports for senior officials. Those officials decide what information to share with field commanders and how to phrase the warnings. At each step in this chain, information can be filtered, softened or withheld. And if someone at the top wanted to ensure that a field commander did not overreact, all they would need to do is control the flow of information down the chain. In the days leading up to December 7th, Kimmel and Short asked Washington for clarification. They wanted to know if the threat was serious enough to disrupt training schedules, cancel liberty, and place their forces on full alert. They were told to use their judgment. That's not guidance. That's deniability. Because if the attack succeeded, Washington could say, "We warned them, they failed to act." And if the attack was prevented, Washington could say, "We told them not to overreact and provoke Japan." Either way, those at the top, those were protected. Kimmel and Short, on the other hand, were exposed. By the morning of December the 7th, they had done what they believed was appropriate based on the information they had. Ships were in port because it was Sunday. Aircraft were parked because the primary threat was thought to be sabotage. Defensive measures focused on internal security, and then the sky filled with enemy planes. Afterward, both men would be blamed for the disaster. They were relieved of command within weeks of the attack. Their careers were destroyed, their reputations were shattered. Official investigations would cite failures in judgment, failures in communication, failures in leadership. But some would argue that the real failure was not theirs. It was the failure of those who saw the warning signs and chose to send messages that sounded like warnings but functioned like silence. Chapter 5. The Radar Contact. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a decision made, a rare message ignored, a chance missed. For Pearl Harbor, that moment came just after 7 in the morning. Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott were stationed at the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu. The station was little more than a collection of equipment mounted on a truck, parked on a windswept point overlooking the ocean. Radar was a relatively new technology in 1941. Most military officers didn't fully understand it. The installation at Opana was part of an experimental network designed to detect incoming aircraft and provide early warning of an attack. The equipment was temperamental. The operators were still learning. Training had been minimal, but when it worked well. On the morning of December 7th, Lockard and Elliott had started their shift at 4 in the morning. Their job was to monitor the radar screen and report any unusual contacts to the information centre at Fort Shafter, the hub that coordinated radar reports and managed the air defence network. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but the truck that was supposed to pick them up and take them back to base was running late, so they decided to keep the equipment running while they waited. At 7 and 2 minutes, Lockard noticed something on the screen, a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The contact was strong, unusually so. He checked the equipment. Everything was functioning normally. He called Elliott over. Together they watched the blip on the screen. It was moving fast. Range, 137 miles. Bearing, almost due north. Elliott suggested they report it. Lockard hesitated. It was past their shift time. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe it was just a flock of birds. Radar could pick up large bird formations sometimes, but the contact kept getting stronger. Lockard calculated the speed and trajectory. Whatever it was heading directly toward Oahu. Lockard picked up the phone and called the information centre at Fort Shafter. The phone rang several times before it was answered. Most of the staff had gone to breakfast. The only person still there was a pursuit officer, a junior lieutenant named Kermit Tyler. Tyler was filling in for a more senior officer who was not on duty that morning. It was only his second day working in the information centre. He had limited experience with the radar network. He was not fully briefed on the strategic situation. Lockard explained what they were seeing. A large formation of aircraft, 137 miles out, approaching fast. Tyler listened. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Don't worry about it." Lockard pressed. This was a really large contact, bigger than anything they'd seen during training. Shouldn't someone check it out? Tyler repeated, "Don't worry about it." He later explained that he had assumed the radar contact was a flight of American bombers expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He knew that a group of planes was due. He thought the timing matched. He didn't think it was necessary to verify, but Tyler didn't check with anyone. He didn't consult a schedule. He didn't call the airfields to confirm. He made an assumption and acted on it. Lockard hung up the phone. He and Elliot continued tracking the formation. The contact kept getting closer. 100 miles, 75 miles, 50 miles. At 30 miles out, the contact disappeared from the screen, lost in the clutter of the island's terrain as the aircraft descended toward their targets. Lockard and Elliot shut down the equipment. Their ride finally arrived. They drove back to base, talking about the strange contact and wondering what Tyler had meant when he said not to worry. 20 minutes later, the attack began. This moment has become central to the conspiracy debate, because here was a clear, unambiguous warning. Radar detected the incoming strike force more than 50 minutes before the first bombs fell. That was enough time to scramble fighters, enough time to alert the fleet, enough time to sound air raid sirens, enough time to man anti-aircraft guns, enough time to prepare. But the warning was dismissed by a junior officer who made an assumption without verification. The official explanation is simple: confusion, inexperience, bad luck. Tyler made a mistake. He didn't know any better. Lockard and Elliot followed orders and did not push back. The system failed at the worst possible moment. But conspiracy theorists ask a different question. Why was the radar network operating with minimal personnel that morning? Why was a junior officer with limited experience put in charge of coordinating reports during a period of heightened tension? Why was there no procedure to verify unusual contacts before dismissing them? Some suggest that the radar network was deliberately understaffed and under-prioritized. They argue that if leadership wanted to ensure that an attack would succeed, one way to do that would be to make sure that early warning systems were not taken seriously, to create an environment where ambiguous signals could be explained away without investigation. This is not provable, but it fits a pattern. Because the radar contact was not the only warning ignored that morning. At 6:45, more than an hour before the attack, the destroyer USS Ward was patrolling the entrance to Pearl Harbor when a lookout spotted something unusual: the conning tower of a small submarine. The submarine was in restricted waters, trying to follow an American cargo ship into the harbour. The captain of the Ward, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, ordered his guns to fire. The first shot missed. The second hit the submarine's conning tower. The submarine began to sink. The Ward dropped depth charges to finish it off. Outerbridge immediately reported the engagement by radio. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in defensive sea area." This was not ambiguous. This was not a radar blip that might be friendly aircraft. This was an enemy submarine sunk in American waters. The report was received at the headquarters of the 14th Naval District, which oversaw Pearl Harbor's defences. The duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky, saw the message. He knew it was significant. He called his superior, Admiral Claude Bloch. Bloch was sceptical. There had been false submarine sightings before. He told Kaminsky to verify the report before taking action. Kaminsky tried to reach the Ward for confirmation, but radio communication was difficult. Minutes passed. More calls were made. Officers deliberated. Should they sound an alert? Should they wake up Admiral Kimmel? While they debated, time ran out. At 7:55, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Afterward, investigators would call these failures tragic mistakes, examples of how peacetime complacency and communication breakdowns can lead to disaster. But critics point out that these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of warnings seen, reported, and then set aside. Radar detected the incoming strike force, ignored. A submarine was sunk in defensive waters, debated. Every single early warning mechanism functioned correctly. The technology worked. The people did their jobs. The information reached decision makers, but every decision maker chose not to act. Was it really just coincidence that every single safeguard failed at the exact same time? Or was the system designed to fail? This is the question that refuses to go away. Because if Pearl Harbor was truly a surprise, then the failures that allowed it to happen were almost impossibly unlucky. Radar worked perfectly but was dismissed. Submarines were detected and sunk but not reported effectively. Warnings were issued but phrased vaguely enough to be ignored. But if Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen, then those same failures start to look like something else. Not mistakes, choices, because the best way to ensure that an attack succeeds is not to disable the defences. It's to make sure that when the defences sound the alarm, no one listens. Chapter 6. The Attack and Immediate Aftermath. At 7:55 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack from his position in a level bomber high above the harbour. Below him, the American fleet lay at anchor in neat rows, exactly as intelligence reports had described. 8 battleships along Battleship Row, cruisers and destroyers in the harbour, aircraft parked wing to wing on the airfields. Fuchida gave the signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code that meant they had achieved complete surprise. 183 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and level bombers descended on the harbour in coordinated waves. The attack was precise, devastating, and overwhelming. Within minutes, the harbour was engulfed in chaos. The first bombs fell on the airfields. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel were eating breakfast when they heard explosions. They ran outside and saw aircraft with red circles on their wings strafing the parked planes. Fuel tanks exploded. Hangars collapsed. Men dove for cover as machine gun fire tore through buildings. At Wheeler Field, rows of fighters sat parked close together, a perfect target. Japanese pilots made low passes, firing into the clustered aircraft. Within minutes, most of the fighters were destroyed or damaged beyond use. Pilots sprinted toward the few planes that were still intact, desperate to get airborne. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach an auxiliary field where a few P-40 fighters had been dispersed. They took off without orders, without clearance, without waiting for permission. They climbed into the smoke-filled sky and engaged the Japanese aircraft. They were among the few American pilots to get airborne that morning. On Battleship Row, sailors heard the explosions from the airfields and looked up to see aircraft approaching. Some still thought it was a drill. Then they saw the torpedoes in the water. The torpedoes were specially designed for Pearl Harbor. The harbour was shallow, only 40 feet deep in many places. Standard torpedoes would have hit the bottom before reaching their targets. So Japanese engineers modified the torpedoes with wooden fins that allowed them to run shallow. It was an innovation that would prove devastatingly effective. The USS Oklahoma was hit first. 3 torpedoes struck her port side within seconds. The battleship shuddered. Water poured into the hull through massive holes. The ship began to list. Sailors below decks heard the explosions and felt the ship tilting. They tried to evacuate, but the corridors were flooding. Watertight doors were being sealed to slow the flooding, trapping men inside. The lights went out. In the darkness, men scrambled upward, trying to reach the open air. The Oklahoma continued to roll. 5 minutes after the first torpedo hit, she capsized completely. Her masts touched the harbour bottom. Her hull rose into the air red with rust and covered in barnacles. Inside, more than 400 men were trapped. Some were in compartments that still had air. They pounded on the bulkheads, shouting for help. They could hear rescue crews on the outside trying to cut through the steel. But the Oklahoma's hull was thick armour plate. Cutting through it would take time. For some, help arrived. Rescue crews worked through the night, using torches to burn through the metal. 32 men were pulled out alive over the next day. For the others, no help came in time. The USS West Virginia took 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits. She settled into the harbour mud. leaning against the USS Tennessee, which was moored alongside her. The Tennessee was trapped, unable to move. The USS Arizona took a direct hit from an armor-piercing bomb at 8 and 6 minutes. The bomb was a modified 16-inch naval shell dropped from altitude. It punched through the deck and detonated in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted the entire ship out of the water. Men on nearby vessels saw a massive fireball erupt from the Arizona's bow. Debris, metal, equipment, human remains rained down across the harbour. The force of the blast was felt miles away. The Arizona's forward structure collapsed. Fire engulfed the ship. Fuel oil spread across the water, igniting into a sea of flame. Men jumped overboard, only to find themselves swimming through burning oil. The Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes. Of her crew of 1,500, more than 1,000 died. Most never made it out of the ship. They were killed instantly by the explosion or trapped below decks as the ship went down. Even today, the Arizona leaks oil. Droplets rise to the surface, slow, steady, endless. They call them the Tears of the Arizona. The USS Nevada was the only battleship that managed to get underway during the attack. Her crew saw the assault developing and made a desperate attempt to reach the open ocean. They cut the mooring lines and started moving down the channel toward the harbour entrance. Japanese pilots saw the Nevada moving and concentrated their attack on her. If the Nevada could be sunk in the channel, she would block the entire harbour, trapping every other ship inside. Bombs struck the Nevada's deck. Fire broke out. The ship was taking heavy damage. Realising that she might not make it to open water, and knowing that sinking in the channel would be disastrous, the Nevada's captain deliberately ran her aground near Hospital Point. She would survive, but she would not escape. The USS California took 2 torpedo hits and settled slowly into the mud. The USS Maryland and USS Pennsylvania were damaged but remained afloat. The USS Tennessee, trapped by the sinking West Virginia, suffered bomb damage but stayed operational. By the time the first wave ended, Battleship Row was a vision of hell. Ships burning. Smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. Bodies in the water. Wreckage everywhere. The harbour was covered in oil that burned with a thick black smoke, and then the second wave arrived. 170 aircraft struck an hour after the first wave. They targeted ships that had survived the initial attack. They hit fuel depots, repair facilities, dry docks. They strafed anything that moved. American forces fought back desperately. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of shrapnel. Sailors worked to save their ships, battling fires and flooding with whatever tools they had. Some used buckets to bail water. Some formed human chains to pass ammunition to gun crews. Men performed acts of extraordinary courage. Petty Officer Doris Miller, a cook on the USS West Virginia, carried wounded sailors to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use, and fired at Japanese aircraft until he ran out of ammunition. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding officer of the West Virginia, was mortally wounded by shrapnel but refused to leave his post. He continued giving orders even as he bled out on the deck. At 10 in the morning, it was over. The Japanese aircraft turned north and flew back toward their carriers, which were waiting 200 miles away. They had achieved near-total surprise. They had inflicted catastrophic damage. They had lost only 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. The United States lost 8 battleships, either sunk or heavily damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were destroyed, or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded. Pearl Harbor, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific, was crippled. But there was something else that happened that day, something less visible but equally significant. The nation united. Before December 7th, America was divided. Isolationists and interventionists argued bitterly about the war in Europe and Asia. Public opinion was fragmented. Congress was gridlocked. Mothers protested. Politicians campaigned on neutrality. The America First Committee held rallies. After December 7th, all of that evaporated. The attack was seen as treacherous, unprovoked, and barbaric. The fact that it came while Japanese diplomats were still in Washington conducting peace negotiations made it even worse. Americans were outraged. The debate over intervention ended instantly. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly agreed on one thing: Japan had to be stopped. Recruiting stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up for blocks, desperate to enlist. Women volunteered for defence work. Factories began converting to military production. The entire nation mobilised with a speed and unity that had seemed impossible just days before. On December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech was brief, direct, and powerful. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He called for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one representative, Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into the First World War, voted against it. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honouring their alliance with Japan. America was now fully committed to the Second World War. In the space of a single morning, everything changed. And this is where the conspiracy theory finds its deepest resonance. Because the outcome of Pearl Harbor was exactly what Roosevelt and his advisors had said was needed. The nation was united. Public opinion shifted overnight. The political obstacles to entering the war vanished. The isolationists were silenced. The debate was over. Critics argue that this is too convenient to be coincidental. They point out that the attack achieved every strategic goal that American leadership had been unable to accomplish through diplomacy or persuasion. It gave the United States the moral high ground. It justified full mobilization. It silenced opposition. Official history says that these outcomes were the result of Japanese aggression and American resilience. The conspiracy theory says they were the result of calculated risk, a gamble that the cost of allowing an attack would be worth the benefit of entering the war, united. To be clear, there is no definitive proof that Roosevelt or his administration deliberately allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. But the question persists because the political and strategic context makes the theory plausible, and because the investigations that followed left too many questions unanswered. The fires burned for days. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage. Survivors wandered in shock, some still covered in oil, some badly burned. And in Washington, officials began preparing their defence. Not defence against Japan, defence against the questions that would inevitably come. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What did you know? And when did you know it? Chapter 7. The Investigations. After Pearl Harbor, the nation demanded answers. How could this have happened? How could the most powerful navy in the world be caught so completely off guard? Who was responsible? Who should be punished? Over the next several years, multiple investigations were conducted, committees formed, hearings were held, witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, and when it was all over, the conclusions were complex, contradictory, and politically charged. The first investigation began immediately after the attack. It was led by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts and included 2 Army generals and 2 Navy admirals. The Roberts Commission was tasked with determining why Pearl Harbor's defences had failed and who was to blame. The commission worked quickly. They arrived in Hawaii on December 22nd, just 15 days after the attack. They interviewed witnesses, they reviewed communications, they examined defensive procedures. On January 23, 1942, they released their findings. The conclusion was damning. Admiral Kimmel and General Short had not taken adequate defensive measures, despite receiving warnings. They had failed to coordinate their defences. They had not properly assessed the threat. They were guilty of dereliction of duty. Both men were immediately relieved of command. Their careers were over, their reputations were destroyed. But Kimmel and Short protested. They argued that the warnings they had received had been vague and incomplete. They claimed that critical intelligence had been withheld from them. They pointed out that Washington had access to information that was never shared with Hawaii. They demanded access to classified materials to defend themselves. Their requests were denied. National security, they were told, wartime secrecy. The intelligence sources could not be revealed. The investigation moved forward without allowing Kimmel and Short to see the evidence that might have exonerated them. Further investigations followed. A Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944, an Army Board later that same year, a joint congressional investigation in 1945 and 1946. Each one examined communications intelligence, reports and decisions made in the weeks before the attack. Each one produced thousands of pages of testimony and analysis. The findings were consistent in some areas and contradictory in others. All of the investigations concluded that there had been failures in communication. Intelligence agencies had not shared information effectively. Warnings had been misunderstood or downplayed. Commanders in Hawaii had not been fully informed of the strategic picture. But none of the investigations found evidence of deliberate negligence or conspiracy. Responsibility was spread across multiple agencies. Some officials were criticised, some procedures were changed, but no single person beyond Kimmel and Short was held accountable for the broader systemic failures. Conspiracy theorists point to the investigations as further evidence of a cover-up. They note that many intelligence documents were classified and withheld from public scrutiny. They argue that the investigations focused on field commanders while protecting higher-level officials. They claim that uncomfortable questions were deflected or ignored. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigations involved the magic intercepts. They decoded Japanese diplomatic messages that American intelligence had been reading for months. The existence of magic was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The ability to read Japanese codes gave the United States an enormous intelligence advantage, and protecting that advantage was considered vital to winning the war. During the early investigations, magic was not mentioned. Witnesses were instructed not to discuss it. Documents referencing magic were withheld. Even the investigators did not have full access to the intercepts. This meant that critical pieces of evidence, messages that might have shown how much Washington knew and when they knew it, were kept out of the official record. It wasn't until after the war ended that magic was declassified, and researchers could finally examine the full scope of intelligence available before Pearl Harbor. What they found was troubling. The intercepts showed that American intelligence had been reading Japanese diplomatic communications for months. They had seen messages indicating that war was imminent. They had intercepted requests for detailed information about Pearl Harbor. They had decoded messages setting deadlines and discussing military preparations. In hindsight, the intelligence was much clearer than officials had admitted during the investigations, but by the time these documents were declassified, most of the key figures were dead. Roosevelt had died in 1945. Many of the senior military officers from 1941 had retired or passed away. The historical record was incomplete, and definitive answers remained elusive. What the investigations did establish was a pattern of institutional failure. Intelligence agencies operated in silos. The Army had its intelligence service. The Navy had its own. The FBI monitored domestic threats. The State Department handled diplomatic intelligence. Each agency collected information, but did not always share effectively with the others. Communication between military branches was poor. The Army was responsible for defending Hawaii from land-based threats. The Navy was responsible for defending against sea-based threats. But there was no unified command structure. No one person was responsible for coordinating all defensive efforts. Assumptions went unchallenged. The prevailing belief that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked was never seriously questioned. Intelligence that contradicted this assumption was dismissed or explained away. Warnings were diluted as they moved through bureaucracy. Clear, urgent assessments from mid-level analysts were softened into vague, bureaucratic language by the time they reached senior officials, and by the time they reached field commanders, they had lost most of their urgency. Whether those failures were accidental or intentional is the question that has never been fully resolved. Because in the end, the investigations confirmed that Pearl Harbor could have been prevented. but they did not answer whether anyone chose not to prevent it. Kimmel and Short became the official scapegoats. They were blamed for not doing more with the information they had. But many historians argue that they were set up to fail, given vague warnings, denied critical intelligence, and then blamed when the inevitable happened. Both men spent the rest of their lives trying to clear their names. They wrote letters, they gave interviews, they petitioned for their cases to be reopened. Kimmel died in 1968, still insisting that he had been unfairly blamed for a failure that belonged to Washington. Short died in 1949, bitter and broken. In the decades since, there have been efforts to posthumously restore their ranks and clear their reputations. Some official reviews have concluded that they were not solely responsible for the disaster, but the debate continues, because if Kimmel and Short were not to blame, then who was? Was it the intelligence agencies that failed to share information? Was it the senior officials who sent vague warnings instead of clear orders? Was it the system itself, designed in a way that made failure almost inevitable? Or was it something more deliberate, a decision made at the highest levels to allow the attack to happen? The investigations never answered that question, and perhaps they were never meant to. Chapter 8. The conspiracy takes shape. In the years following the war, as classified documents were slowly released and veterans began sharing their experiences, a new narrative began to emerge. It started with questions from historians and journalists who noticed inconsistencies in the official record. Why had so much intelligence pointed toward an attack, yet no effective action was taken? Why had field commanders been kept in the dark about the severity of the threat? Why had warnings been so vague? Why had documents been withheld from investigators? Some researchers began to argue that the failures were not failures at all. They were decisions. The conspiracy theory rests on several key claims. First, that American intelligence knew more than it admitted, that the intercepted Japanese communications made it clear that war was imminent and that an attack on Pearl Harbor was possible, if not probable. The magic intercepts support this claim. Messages from late November showed Tokyo setting deadlines, preparing for military action, and requesting detailed intelligence on Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers read these messages in real time. Senior officials in Washington saw them. Second, that this intelligence was deliberately withheld from commanders in Hawaii. That vague warnings were sent not to alert them, but to provide plausible deniability later. The warnings sent to Kimmel and Short emphasized general vigilance, but did not convey the urgency or specificity that would have justified placing Pearl Harbor on full alert. Meanwhile, officials in Washington had access to intelligence that painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Third, that President Roosevelt and his inner circle understood that only a dramatic attack on American soil would unite the nation and justify entry into the war, that they saw Pearl Harbor not as a catastrophe to be prevented, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Roosevelt's political situation in late 1941 supports this interpretation. He believed that American involvement in the war was necessary. He had tried to move public opinion through speeches and diplomacy, but the isolationist movement remained strong. Without a catalyst, he could not bring the nation into the war. And fourth, that after the attack a coordinated effort was made to obscure the truth, that investigations were steered away from uncomfortable conclusions, that documents were classified, that scapegoats were chosen to protect higher-level officials. The handling of the investigation supports this claim. Critical intelligence was withheld. Key witnesses were not allowed to see classified materials. The focus remained on field commanders rather than systemic failures or decisions made in Washington. To be absolutely clear, this is interpretation, not established fact. There is no smoking gun document in which Roosevelt orders Pearl Harbor to be left undefended. There is no memo that says, "Let the attack happen." The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, withheld intelligence and strategic outcomes. But the theory persists because it offers an explanation for a series of events that otherwise seem inexplicable. How could so many warnings have been missed? How could so many opportunities to prevent the attack have been squandered? How could the outcome have been so perfectly aligned with American strategic interests? Proponents of the conspiracy theory do not claim that Roosevelt wanted Americans to die. They claim that he made a calculated decision, that the cost of allowing an attack measured in ships, lives and national trauma was worth the benefit of entering the war united and with overwhelming public support. It is a cold calculation, a ruthless one. But it is not without precedent in history. Leaders have always faced impossible choices. Winston Churchill allegedly allowed German bombers to destroy Coventry, rather than reveal that British intelligence had broken German codes. Harry Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities to end the war quickly. Lyndon Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam based on questionable intelligence about an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Throughout history, leaders have weighed lives against strategy. They have made decisions that cost some to save others. They have chosen silence over transparency when they believed the stakes were high enough. The question is not whether such choices exist. The question is whether Pearl Harbor was one of them. Critics of the conspiracy theory point out that it requires a level of coordination and secrecy that would have been nearly impossible to maintain. It assumes that dozens of officials across multiple agencies all understood the plan and kept silent. It assumes that no one, no aide, no analyst, no clerk, ever spoke out or left evidence of the conspiracy. They argue that the simpler explanation is the correct one, that Pearl Harbor was a genuine surprise enabled by bureaucratic failure, overconfidence, and bad luck. And yet, the questions remain. Because even if the conspiracy theory is not true, the failures that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen were so profound, so systematic, and so consequential that they demand a better answer than mistakes were made. Consider the timeline. July 1941, Roosevelt imposes oil embargo on Japan. Late November, Japanese carriers disappear from intelligence tracking. November 27, vague war warnings sent to Hawaii. December 2nd, Kimmel asks where the carriers are. No one knows. December 6th, final intercepts indicate war will begin within hours. December 7th, morning, radar detects incoming aircraft. Warning ignored. December 7th, morning, submarine sunk in defensive waters. Report delayed. December the 7th, 7:55. Attack begins. At every single step, there were opportunities to prevent or mitigate the disaster. At every single step, those opportunities were not taken. Was that really just bad luck? Or was it something else? That is why the theory endures. Not because there is definitive proof, but because the alternative explanation, that everything went wrong by coincidence, seems almost as hard to believe as the conspiracy itself. Chapter 9. The Moral Question. Strip away the politics, strip away the strategy, strip away the classified documents and the endless debates over who knew what and when. What you're left with is a moral question that has no easy answer. If leaders knew that war was coming, if they knew that Japan was likely to strike, did they have an obligation to prevent that strike, even if it meant prolonging political division and delaying American entry into the war? Or did they have an obligation to allow the strike, understanding that only a direct attack would unite the nation and enable the mobilization needed to defeat fascism? This is the terrain of moral philosophy, not history. And it is the terrain on which the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory ultimately rests. Let's explore both sides. On one side, there is the argument for transparency and defense. Leaders have a duty to protect their people. That is the most fundamental responsibility of government. If an attack can be prevented, it must be prevented. To knowingly allow Americans to die, even for strategic reasons, is a betrayal of the social contract between government and citizen. The men who died at Pearl Harbor did not consent to be sacrificed. They were sailors and soldiers doing their jobs, trusting that their leaders would do everything possible to keep them safe. If those leaders chose to withhold warnings or intelligence that might have saved lives, then those leaders violated that trust in the most profound way. From this perspective, The ends do not justify the means. Even if allowing Pearl Harbor to happen brought the nation into the war and ultimately saved millions of lives, the decision to sacrifice 2,000 Americans without their knowledge or consent was morally wrong. On the other side, there is the argument for the greater good. Leaders must sometimes make terrible choices. They must weigh competing interests and decide which outcome will cause the least harm in the long run. In late 1941, Roosevelt faced an impossible situation. He believed, correctly, as history would prove, that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan posed existential threats, not just to their neighbours, but to human freedom itself. Millions were already dying in Europe and Asia. Britain was on the brink of collapse. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. China was being devastated. If the United States remained neutral, the Axis powers might win. The consequences of that outcome would be catastrophic, not just for Europe and Asia, but eventually for the United States itself. But the American public would not support intervention. They wanted to stay out of foreign wars. They believed the ocean would protect them. No amount of speeches or diplomacy could change their minds. From this perspective, allowing Pearl Harbor to happen, if that's what occurred, was a terrible choice made in service of a greater good. 2,000 lives were lost, but their sacrifice brought the nation into a war that ultimately saved millions and prevented the triumph of totalitarianism. This is utilitarian ethics, the calculation of lives saved versus lives lost, the greater good versus individual rights. It is the same ethical framework that would later justify dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians died, but the alternative, a full invasion of Japan, might have cost millions of lives on both sides. So which framework is correct? That depends on what you believe about the nature of leadership and the limits of acceptable sacrifice. If you believe that leaders must never knowingly sacrifice their own people, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was an unforgivable betrayal. If you believe that leaders must sometimes make terrible choices to prevent even worse outcomes, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was a tragic but necessary decision. There is no right answer. There is only the answer that each person must reach for themselves based on their own moral framework. But consider this thought experiment. Imagine you are President Roosevelt in November 1941. You know that Nazi Germany has conquered most of Europe. You know that the Holocaust is underway, though the full scale is not yet understood. You know that Britain is barely holding on, dependent on American supplies that are being sunk by German submarines. You know that if Britain falls, the United States will face a hostile Europe alone. You know that Japan is expanding across Asia, committing atrocities in China, and threatening American interest in the Pacific. You know that economic pressure has made war with Japan almost inevitable. You know that your own nation refuses to enter the war. 80% of Americans oppose intervention. Congress will not declare war without overwhelming public support. The isolationists are powerful and vocal. You believe deeply, with every fibre of your being, that American involvement is necessary, that without it, the Axis will win and the world will fall into darkness. Then intelligence reports indicate that Japan may be preparing to attack American territory. The attack could be prevented with decisive action, dispersing the fleet, placing Hawaii on full alert, scrambling reconnaissance flights. But preventing the attack means maintaining the status quo. The nation remains divided. The war in Europe continues without American involvement. Millions more die while you watch helplessly. Allowing the attack means accepting terrible losses. Ships will be sunk, men will die, but the nation will unite overnight. Public opinion will shift instantly. Congress will declare war, and American power, industrial, military, moral, will be brought to bear against fascism. What do? Do you prevent the attack and accept that the war may be lost without American involvement? Or do you allow the attack knowing that the lives lost will be the price of victory? This is the question that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront, and it has no easy answer, because the truth is, we don't know what we would do in that situation. We can theorize, we can argue, we can apply ethical frameworks, but unless you are actually faced with that choice, unless you bear that responsibility, you cannot know for certain what decision you would make. This is why the conspiracy theory persists even in the absence of definitive proof. Because it asks a question that goes beyond Pearl Harbor. It asks, what are the limits of acceptable sacrifice? It asks, can leaders justify sacrificing some to save others? It asks, who gets to make that decision, and who has to live with the consequences? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that every generation must answer when faced with impossible choices. Pearl Harbor forces us to ask them. Whether the attack was allowed to happen or not, the moral question remains. Chapter 10. Why the question persists. 80 years have passed since Pearl Harbor. The generation that fought the Second World War is almost gone. The ships that sank that day have been memorialized. The Arizona remains underwater, a tomb for the men who never left. The lessons have been studied in military academies around the world. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry, a warning against complacency. And yet, the question refuses to die. Why? Part of the answer is incomplete information. Many documents related to Pearl Harbor remain classified. Some were destroyed during the war, others were lost or misfiled, and some decisions were made in private conversations that left no record. Phone calls between Roosevelt and his advisors, discussions in the Oval Office, orders given verbally rather than in writing. Without complete transparency, doubt persists. Researchers continue to file Freedom of Information Act requests. Archives are periodically reviewed. Occasionally new documents surface, but the full picture remains elusive. Part of the answer is historical pattern. Pearl Harbor was not the first time that a nation was caught off guard by an attack. And in the decades since, there have been other intelligence failures, other moments where warnings were missed or ignored. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where reports of North Vietnamese attacks on American ships were later revealed to be exaggerated or misinterpreted, leading to American escalation in Vietnam. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, where American intelligence failed to predict the fall of the Shah despite clear signs of instability. September 11, 2001, where intelligence agencies had information suggesting that terrorists were planning attacks using aircraft, but the warnings were not acted upon effectively. Each time, questions arise. Were these genuine failures, or were they something more? The repetition of the pattern makes conspiracy theories more plausible. It suggests that intelligence failures are not anomalies, they are features of the system. Part of the answer is the outcome itself. Pearl Harbor did unite the nation. It did enable American entry into the war. It did lead to the defeat of fascism, and in hindsight, it is almost impossible to imagine the Second World War ending the way it did without American involvement. American industrial power produced the ships, aircraft, tanks and supplies that overwhelmed the Axis. American manpower tipped the balance in Europe and the Pacific. American resources sustained the Allied war effort. Without Pearl Harbor, would the United States have entered the war at all? And if not, what would the world look like today? So even if the attack was not deliberately allowed, it achieved the result that leadership needed. And that makes it hard to separate failure from intent, because the consequences of Pearl Harbor were exactly what Roosevelt had argued was necessary. The nation mobilized, public opinion shifted, the isolationists were silenced, and America became, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Researchers will continue to debate, new documents will be declassified, new analyses will be published, conferences will be held, books will be written. But a definitive answer may never come, because the question of Pearl Harbor is not really about evidence. It is about trust. Do we trust that leaders tell us the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable? Do we trust that when disasters happen, they happen because of mistakes, not choices? Do we trust that those in power prioritize our safety over strategic goals? These are not questions that documents can answer. They are questions that each person must answer for themselves, based on their understanding of history and their beliefs about human nature. For some, the official narrative is sufficient. Pearl Harbor was a tragedy. It was a failure of communication, coordination, and preparedness. It was a lesson learned. The system was reformed. Safeguards were put in place. It won't happen again. For others, the gaps in the story are too large to ignore. They see a pattern of warnings missed, decisions delayed, and outcomes too convenient. They see documents withheld, investigations limited, and scapegoats chosen, and they conclude that something more was happening beneath the surface. And for all of us, Pearl Harbor remains a reminder of how fragile security can be, and how quickly the world can change. Because that's what Pearl Harbor demonstrated most powerfully. In a matter of hours, everything changed. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. And once that change happened, there was no going back. The America that existed on December 6th, 1941, was gone forever. The isolationism that had defined American foreign policy for decades was finished. The debate over intervention was over. Pearl Harbor created a new America, one that would emerge from the war as a superpower, with military bases around the world, alliances across continents, and a permanent role in global affairs. That transformation was inevitable once the attack happened. The question is whether someone understood that and made sure the attack happened. Epilogue. The line between failure and choice. Stand at the memorial today, and you can still see the outline of the USS Arizona beneath the water. The white memorial structure spans the sunken hull, reflecting in the calm harbour. Oil still seeps from the ship, slow, dark droplets rising to the surface. They call them the tears of the Arizona, the tears that never stop. More than 2,000 names are inscribed on the walls. Each one represents a life cut short, a family shattered, a future erased. Young men who never got to grow old, who never got to see their children, who never got to live the lives they had planned. Pearl Harbor is remembered as a day of infamy, a surprise attack, a turning point in history. But history is rarely as simple as the monuments we build to commemorate it. Because underneath the heroism and the sacrifice and the unity that followed, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Was Pearl Harbor a failure to see the warning signs, or was it a decision to let them unfold? Official history tells us it was the former. The conspiracy theory suggests it was the latter. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps it was not a deliberate conspiracy, but a series of choices to prioritize some intelligence over others, to delay action, to avoid confrontation, to hope that diplomacy might still work, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Perhaps it was not malice, but calculation, recognition that war was inevitable, and that the question was not whether to fight, but how to enter the fight with the nation behind you. Perhaps the line between failure and choice is thinner than we want to believe. Because in the end, the question is not just about Pearl Harbor. It is about every moment in history when leaders faced impossible decisions. Every time they weighed lives against strategy. Every time they chose silence over transparency. Every time they let events unfold because intervention seemed worse than inaction. And it is about what we, as citizens, demand from those who lead us. Do we demand the truth, even when it is painful? Do we demand accountability, even when it is inconvenient? Do we demand that our safety comes first, even when the cost is high? Or do we accept that sometimes the greater good requires sacrifice, and that those sacrifices are made without our knowledge or consent? These are not easy questions. They are the questions that Pearl Harbor forces us to ask. On December the 7th, 1941, the world changed in a matter of hours. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. Whether that change was the result of failure or choice, accident or design, is something each person must decide for themselves. But one thing is certain. When history shifts overnight, when the unthinkable becomes real, when the warnings we ignored become the disasters we must face, we cannot help but ask, was it destiny, or was it decision? And if it was decision, whose decision was it? The fires burned for 3 days at Pearl Harbor. The The smoke could be seen from miles away. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage for weeks. Some were never found. The Arizona still holds more than 900 men in her hull. They were never recovered. The ship is their tomb. Every year, survivors of Pearl Harbor and, now descendants of survivors, gather at the memorial. They drop flower petals into the water. They remember the friends they lost. They tell their stories to younger generations. And they always ask the same question: could this have been prevented? The official investigation said no, or at least not without information that commanders did not have. The conspiracy theorists say yes, with information that was deliberately withheld. The truth is probably more complex than either answer suggests, because preventing Pearl Harbor would have required many things to go right. It would have required intelligence agencies to share information effectively. It would have required warnings to be specific and urgent. It would have required field commanders to be given full access to classified materials. It would have required someone in authority to challenge the prevailing assumptions about Japan's capabilities and intentions. All of that was possible, none of it happened. Whether that was failure or choice, incompetence or strategy, is the question that will haunt Pearl Harbor forever. Because the answer matters. If Pearl Harbor was a failure, then we learn lessons about communication, coordination, and vigilance. We reform institutions. We create safeguards. We try to prevent it from happening again. If Pearl Harbor was a choice, then we confront uncomfortable truths about power, sacrifice, and the limits of democracy. We ask whether leaders can be trusted. We question official narratives. We demand transparency. Both answers have consequences, and neither answer brings back the men who died, so we remember them. We memorialize them. We tell their stories, and we ask the question that refuses to die. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming, or because someone chose not to look? The oil still rises from the Arizona, the tears still fall, and the question still remains. Thank you for listening. Snow-cold silence. The Karen Red case. Thanks to Kristin for this incredible story idea. Now let's begin tonight's breakdown. The night was ending, but for some, it would never truly be over. Picture a quiet Massachusetts suburb blanketed in fresh snow. The kind of snow that muffles sound, that makes the world feel suspended in time. In those early morning hours of January 29th, 2022, a Lexus SUV backed out of a residential driveway at 7 minutes past 5 in the morning. The camera captured it all in grainy detail. Inside that vehicle sat Karen Reed, a financial analyst whose life was about to become a national obsession. What she didn't know as those tyres crunched over ice was that her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, lay dying in the snow just miles away. And what none of them knew was that this death would unravel into one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern Massachusetts history, splitting a community down the middle and raising questions that still echo through courtrooms and living rooms across America. This is not just a story about a death in the snow. This is a story about what happens when the people sworn to find the truth might be the ones hiding it. The night everything changed. January 28th, 2022 started like many winter weekends in the Boston area. Karen Red and John O'Keefe had been dating for over 2 years. He was a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, a father figure to his niece and nephew after his sister's death, a man known for his dedication to family and his work. Karen was successful in her own right, established in her career, respected by colleagues. They were the kind of couple that seemed solid, the kind neighbours would describe as nice people, without a second thought. Around 9 that evening, they arrived at the Waterfall Bar and Grill in Canton, Massachusetts. It was a typical night out, drinks with friends, laughter cutting through the winter chill that had settled over the region. Security cameras captured them entering together. Witnesses later recalled seeing them at the bar, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the tragedy waiting in the hours ahead. The evening wore on, drinks were poured, conversations flowed, and eventually, as it always does, the night began winding down. After midnight, they left the bar. This is where the story everyone thought they knew begins to fracture into competing narratives, each one claiming truth, each one pointing fingers in different directions. According to the prosecution's version of events, Karen and John drove to 34 Fairview Road, the home of Brian Albert, a former Boston police officer who had retired from the force. It was supposed to be an after-party, a chance to continue the night's festivities in a more private setting. But somewhere in the confusion of that snowy night, something went terribly wrong. At 5 on the morning of January 29th, surveillance footage captured Karen's Lexus SUV backing out of the garage at John's residence in Canton. The timestamp would become crucial, dissected frame by frame in the investigation to come. Shortly after that footage was recorded, John O'Keefe was found lying in the snow outside 34 Fairview Road. He was unresponsive, his body already succumbing to the brutal Massachusetts winter. Emergency responders arrived to find a man face down in the snow, his clothing soaked through, his body temperature dangerously low. They rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was done. At 7:59 that morning, John O'Keefe was pronounced dead. The cause, according to the initial medical examination, was blunt force trauma to the head combined with hypothermia. A police officer, a father figure, a boyfriend, gone in the span of a few frozen hours. The question everyone immediately asked was simple. What happened? The answer, it turned out, was anything but simple. The investigation begins. When a police officer dies under mysterious circumstances, the investigation typically moves with precision and urgency. Fellow officers rally to find answers, to bring closure to the family, to ensure that justice is served. This case would follow that pattern, but with twists that no one could have predicted. Within days, investigators had begun piecing together what they believed was a clear narrative. They focused on Karen Reed. Her vehicle had a cracked tail light. Fragments of red and clear plastic, consistent with automotive taillight material, were found at the scene where John's body was discovered. Karen had been drinking that night, and her blood alcohol level, recorded later that morning, was elevated. To the initial investigators, it seemed straightforward. A tragic accident caused by impaired driving. Karen had struck John with her vehicle, either while dropping him off or during some kind of altercation, and then fled the scene in panic or confusion. On February 2nd, just 4 days after John's death, Karen Reed was arrested. The charges were severe: manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. Each charge carried significant prison time. The district attorney's office presented their case to the public with confidence. They had physical evidence, they had motive in the form of relationship troubles, and they had witnesses who would testify to seeing the aftermath. But even as the prosecution built their case, cracks were beginning to show. Questions emerged that didn't have easy answers. Witnesses offered contradictory statements. Evidence that should have been clear-cut became murky under scrutiny. And Karen Reed, through her attorneys, began to tell a very different story. The defence didn't just argue that Karen was innocent of accidentally striking John with her vehicle. They argued something far more explosive, that John O'Keefe never died, outside 34 Fairview Road. They claimed he died inside the house, the victim of an assault by people who were supposed to be his friends, his colleagues in law enforcement, and they argued that those same people, desperate to cover up their involvement, had framed Karen Reed for a crime she didn't commit. It was a conspiracy theory in the truest sense. And like all conspiracy theories that gain traction, it was built on a foundation of suspicious coincidences, unanswered questions, and a deep distrust of the official narrative. The theory that changed everything. In April 2023, more than a year after John's death, Karen Reed's defence team went public with their alternative theory in a dramatic fashion. They released affidavits, held press conferences, and launched what they called the Canton Cover-Up campaign. The name itself was designed to provoke, to suggest that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or faulty investigation, but an active conspiracy involving multiple law enforcement officers working together to frame an innocent woman. The defence's theory was elaborate but internally consistent. They argued that on that night in January 2022, John O'Keefe did go to 34 Fairview Road, but he went inside the house. Once there, according to this theory, he was involved in some kind of altercation. Perhaps it was an argument that escalated. Perhaps it was a physical confrontation that went too far. The specifics were unclear, but the result, the defence claimed, was that John was severely injured inside that home. Faced with a dying or dead police officer in their house, the occupants panicked. These weren't random civilians. They were current and former law enforcement, people who understood exactly how serious the situation was, people who knew how investigations worked, people who had the connections and knowledge to potentially manipulate the system. So instead of calling for help, instead of telling the truth, they made a different choice. They carried John's body outside, placed him in the snow, and began constructing an alternative narrative that would shift blame onto Karen Reed. It sounds almost too calculated to be believable. But the defence had evidence to support their claims, and some of it was genuinely disturbing. The most striking piece of evidence was a Google search conducted on a phone associated with the Albert household. At 27 minutes past 2 in the morning on January 29th, hours before John's body was officially discovered, someone searched for the phrase, "How long to die in cold?" The timestamp was crucial. If John was already outside at that time, dying in the snow, why would someone inside the house be searching for information about how long hypothermia takes to kill? The defence argued this search was made by someone who knew John was outside, someone who was watching the clock, someone who needed to know how long to wait before discovering the body. Then there was the tail light. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the cracked tail light of Karen's Lexus as proof that she had struck John with her vehicle. But the defence brought in experts who examined photographs of the tail light taken at different times during the investigation. These experts testified that the damage pattern didn't match what would be expected from striking a person. More concerning, they claimed the photographs showed the tail light had been damaged further between initial evidence photos and later examination, suggesting someone had tampered with the evidence to make it appear more consistent with the prosecution's theory. Witness statements also began to unravel under scrutiny. Multiple people who were at 34 Fairview Road that night gave statements to police. But their accounts didn't align. Some said they never saw John arrive. Others said they were asleep and didn't know he'd been there at all. But phone records and other evidence suggested more activity in the house during the crucial hours than these witnesses were admitting. Why would people lie about whether they saw John unless they had something to hide? The investigation of the investigators. As the defence's theory gained public attention, scrutiny fell on the people conducting the investigation. And what emerged from that scrutiny was deeply troubling, regardless of which version of events you believed. The lead investigator on the case was Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor. On the surface, he seemed like a competent officer with years of experience. But as the case progressed, text messages from Proctor's phone were uncovered and released to the defence as part of discovery. What those texts revealed was shocking. Proctor had sent numerous messages to friends and fellow officers about Karen Reed, and they were vicious. He mocked her appearance, made crude sexual comments, and expressed frustration with the case. In one particularly damaging exchange, he wrote about the difficulties in proving the prosecution's theory. "We won't be able to prove she hit him with her car. All the powers that be want answers ASEEP. Zero chance she skates." Read that again. The lead investigator, early in the investigation, was already expressing doubt about whether they could prove their own theory, while simultaneously stating that pressure from superiors meant Karen couldn't be allowed to avoid charges. That's not how justice is supposed to work. Investigations are meant to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not to start with a conclusion and work backward to justify it. The texts got worse. Proctor discussed wanting to use his badge to gain access to Karen's private medical records. He joked about inappropriate searches of her personal information. The pattern was clear. This wasn't an objective investigation. This was a personal crusade. On March 19, 2025, Michael Proctor was fired from the Massachusetts State Police. The official reason was the derogatory texts about Karen Red and alleged mishandling of evidence. By that point, the damage to the prosecution's case was irreversible in the court of public opinion, even if the legal proceedings continued. But Proctor wasn't the only investigator whose conduct raised questions. The defence pointed out numerous unusual aspects of the evidence collection and preservation. Karen's vehicle was towed to a police facility, but instead of being secured in a locked bay as would be standard for such crucial evidence, it was left in an area accessible to multiple officers. Her cell phone from the night of the incident was taken by investigators, but then mysteriously went missing for a period of time before being found again. Chain of custody documentation, which should meticulously track evidence from collection to courtroom, had gaps and inconsistencies. Perhaps most troubling were the connections between the investigators and the potential suspects in the defence's alternative theory. Brian Albert, the owner of 34 Fairview Road, was a former Boston police officer. His brother was an active officer. His wife's sister, Jennifer McCabe, was also at the house that night, and her phone was the one associated with the How Long to Die in Cold search. Another guest at the house was Brian Higgins, an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. These weren't random civilians. These were people embedded in the law enforcement community, people with relationships and connections to the very officers investigating the case. In a normal investigation, those connections would be disclosed and managed to prevent conflicts of interest. Officers with personal relationships to potential witnesses or suspects would recuse themselves. Independent oversight would be brought in. None of that happened here, at least not initially. Instead, the investigation proceeded with investigators who had professional and personal ties to the very people the defence was accusing of murder and conspiracy. The federal investigation. As the case gained national attention and the allegations of misconduct piled up, federal authorities took notice. In early 2025, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division launched an investigation into the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office and the handling of the Karen Reed case. For those who believed in the Canton cover-up theory, this federal investigation was vindication. Finally, they thought, an outside agency with no local connections would uncover the truth. The corruption would be exposed, the real killers would be brought to justice, and Karen Red would be exonerated. But in March 2025, the federal investigation closed without bringing any charges. No indictments were issued against Brian Albert, Jennifer McCabe, Brian Higgins, or anyone else accused in the defence's theory. No charges were brought against Michael Proctor or other investigators for evidence tampering or conspiracy. The investigation simply ended, with federal authorities offering little public explanation for their decision. For the prosecution, this was proof that the conspiracy theory was exactly that. A theory unsupported by evidence robust enough to bring charges. They argued that federal investigators had reviewed all the same evidence the defence pointed to and concluded it didn't support criminal charges against anyone except Karen Red herself. For the defence and their supporters, the closure of the federal investigation without charges only deepened their conviction that the cover-up extended further than they had imagined. They argued that law enforcement agencies protect their own, that the blue wall of silence extended from local police departments to federal agencies. The lack of charges, in their view, wasn't evidence of innocence, but evidence of how deep the corruption ran. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere more complicated than either narrative suggests. Federal investigations close without charges for many reasons. Sometimes it's because no crimes occurred. Sometimes it's because proving a crime beyond a reasonable doubt is impossible, even if investigators suspect wrongdoing. Sometimes it's because the crimes, if they occurred, fall outside federal jurisdiction or don't meet the specific criteria for federal charges. We may never know exactly why the federal investigation closed without action, but its closure didn't end the debate. If anything, it intensified it. The trials. The legal process in the Karen Red case was as dramatic and contentious as the investigation that preceded it. The first trial began on April 16th, 2024, more than 2 years after John O'Keefe's death. The prosecution presented their case: the cracked taillight, the plastic fragments, Karen's elevated blood alcohol level, and testimony from witnesses who described her as distraught and making incriminating statements in the hours after John's body was found. The defence countered with their conspiracy theory, now refined and supported by expert testimony. They brought in accident reconstruction specialists who testified that the injuries to John's body were inconsistent with being struck by a vehicle. They presented the Google search evidence, the text messages from Michael Proctor, and testimony about the connections between investigators and the Albert household. They argued that reasonable doubt wasn't just present in this case, it was overwhelming. For weeks, the jury heard testimony. They saw photographs of John's body, of the crime scene, of Karen's vehicle. They listened to expert witnesses from both sides contradict each other on crucial points. They heard Karen's own voice in recordings from that morning, heard her distress, heard her confusion. On July 1st, 2024, after days of deliberation, the jury announced they were hopelessly deadlocked. They couldn't reach a unanimous verdict on any of the charges. The judge declared a mistrial. Karen Read would not be convicted, but she would not be exonerated either. Instead, she would face a second trial. The retrial began on April 1st, 2025. By this point, the case had become a media sensation. Supporters of Karen Read gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs proclaiming her innocence and demanding justice for what they saw as a law enforcement conspiracy. The trial was live-streamed, with thousands watching the proceedings in real time and dissecting every moment on social media. This time, the jury reached a verdict. On the most serious charges, second-degree murder and manslaughter, they found Karen Read not guilty. They also acquitted her of leaving the scene of an accident. But on one charge, operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol, they found her guilty. The judge sentenced her to 1 year of probation. The split verdict satisfied no one completely. The prosecution argued it proved Karen was impaired and operating her vehicle recklessly that night, even if the jury couldn't conclude she had deliberately or accidentally killed John O'Keefe. The defence and Karen's supporters argued the not guilty verdicts on the most serious charges vindicated their theory that she had been framed, and the single guilty verdict was a compromise by jurors who felt pressure to convict on something after such a lengthy and expensive trial. Karen Red walked out of the courthouse on probation, legally neither fully guilty nor fully innocent in the death of the man she loved. The unanswered questions. Even after 2 trials, after thousands of hours of investigation, after millions of words written and spoken about this case, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Did John O'Keefe ever go inside 34 Fairview Road that night? There is no surveillance footage from inside the house showing his arrival. Every person who was in that house that night claims they did not personally see him enter. Yet the defence argues he must have been inside based on his injuries and the circumstances of his death. Without video evidence or a witness willing to break ranks and tell a different story, this question remains open. What caused John's injuries? The medical examiner who performed the autopsy concluded his injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle and exposure to the cold. But defence experts examined the same body, the same photographs, the same medical data, and concluded his injuries were consistent with a beating, including wounds they argued came from a dog attack based on the pattern of marks on his arm. Two sets of experts, two completely different conclusions. Both can't be right. But how is a jury, or the public, supposed to determine which experts to believe? When exactly did John die? The timeline is crucial to both theories. The prosecution needs him to have been struck by Karen's vehicle and left outside to die in the early morning hours. The defence needs him to have been alive inside the house long enough for the conspiracy to unfold and for that Google search about hypothermia timing to make sense. Phone records show John's phone locked and stopped recording activity at a specific time, but does that mean he died then? Or just that his phone died or was damaged? Who made that Google search? The search for how long to die in cold came from a phone associated with Jennifer McCabe, who was at the Albert House that night. When questioned about it, she denied making the search and suggested it must have been a mistake or an artifact of some technical glitch. Forensic analysts confirmed the search was real and occurred at the timestamp indicated. So who made it and why? Was evidence tampered with? The defence presented testimony suggesting Karen's taillight was damaged further during the investigation to make it more consistent with the prosecution's theory. They pointed to inconsistencies in photographs taken at different times. The prosecution argued any apparent differences were due to lighting, camera angles, or the natural process of collecting and examining fragile evidence. Without a video recording of every moment the vehicle was in custody, proving tampering definitively is nearly impossible, but the suggestion alone casts doubt on the evidence's reliability. Why did Michael Proctor send those texts? Even people who believe in Karen's guilt struggle to defend Proctor's conduct. His messages were inappropriate by any standard, and his admission that they struggled to prove their own theory, while feeling pressure to secure a conviction, is deeply troubling. Was he just a crude, unprofessional investigator who nonetheless pursued a legitimate case, or were his texts evidence of a predetermined conclusion he was trying to justify after the fact? The broader context. The Karen Red case didn't happen in a vacuum. As the case gained national attention, investigative journalists began examining the broader context of law enforcement in Norfolk County and the Canton area. What they found added fuel to the fire of conspiracy theories. In 2021, a woman named Sandra Birchmore died in Canton. The official ruling was suicide, but her family and advocates raised questions about that conclusion. Sandra had been involved with police officers from the Stoughton Police Department, and there were allegations of inappropriate relationships and potential abuse. When her death was initially investigated, some of the same networks of law enforcement officers that would later be connected to the Karen Read case were involved in that investigation as well. The parallels were impossible to ignore for those inclined to see a pattern. Here was another suspicious death in the same county, another investigation involving interconnected law enforcement, personnel, another family left with unanswered questions and suspicions of a cover-up. The Birchmore case eventually led to federal charges against one of the officers involved, Matthew Farwell, but only after years of advocacy by Sandra's family and outside journalists. The fact that it took so long for action to be taken, and that local investigators had initially closed the case, seemed to validate concerns about how law enforcement handled investigations of their own. These connections matter because they shape how people view the Karen Read case. If this were an isolated incident, If there were no other examples of questionable investigations or suspicious deaths in the area, it would be easier to dismiss the conspiracy theory as paranoid fantasy. But when you can point to other cases, other examples of investigations that seem flawed or compromised, the conspiracy theory becomes more plausible. Pattern recognition is a powerful cognitive tool, even when the patterns might be coincidental. The public divide. Perhaps no aspect of the Karen Red case is more striking than how it has split public opinion. This isn't a case where most people believe one narrative with a small minority dissenting. Instead, it's a case where large numbers of passionate, informed people have reached completely opposite conclusions about what happened. On one side are those who believe Karen Read is a victim of a massive law enforcement conspiracy. They attend her court hearings, they organise rallies and fundraisers, they maintain social media accounts dedicated to exposing what they call the Canton cover-up. They see the suspicious Google search, the biased investigator, the connections between officers and witnesses, and they conclude that the only logical explanation is that John O'Keefe was killed inside 34 Fairview Road, and Karen was framed. For them, her conviction on the impaired driving charge is a miscarriage of justice, a compromise verdict by a jury that couldn't bring itself to fully acquit her, despite the overwhelming evidence of reasonable doubt. On the other side are those who believe the prosecution's core theory. They see a tragic case of drunk driving, a woman who made a terrible mistake and then compounded it by refusing to take responsibility. They look at the physical evidence, the cracked tail light, the plastic fragments at the scene, and they see a straightforward explanation. For them, the conspiracy theory is a desperate defense strategy, a Hail Mary attempt to create reasonable doubt by throwing out wild accusations. They point to the federal investigation's closure without charges as proof that outside investigators found no merit to the cover-up claims. They argue that Karen's acquittal on murder charges doesn't prove she's innocent, just that the prosecution couldn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high bar in any case. Between these two camps are people who genuinely aren't sure what to believe. They see troubling elements on both sides. They think Karen might have been involved in John's death, while also believing the investigation was compromised and potentially corrupt. They can imagine scenarios where John went inside the house, but then came back outside where Karen accidentally struck him. They wonder if the truth is some combination of both narratives that neither side is willing to acknowledge. This divide isn't just about the facts of the case, it's about deeper questions of trust. Do you trust law enforcement to investigate itself? Do you believe officers will tell the truth even when it implicates their colleagues and friends? Do you think the justice system works? Or do you think it's rigged in favour of those with power and connections? For many people, the Karen Red case became a referendum on those questions, rather than just a determination of what happened on one snowy night in January. If you already distrusted police, if you already believed the system was corrupt, then the Canton cover-up theory made perfect sense. If you believed in the integrity of law enforcement and the justice system, then Karen's conviction, even the limited one, seemed appropriate. The aftermath. As of now, the legal proceedings continue in different forms. A civil wrongful death lawsuit was filed on August 23, 2024, by John O'Keefe's family against Karen Read and 2 Canton bars that served alcohol that night. The lawsuit is currently stayed pending appeals, but it represents another legal front in a case that seems to have no end point. Karen Red herself remains a controversial figure. To her supporters, she's a folk hero, a whistleblower who exposed corruption at the highest levels of Massachusetts law enforcement. They've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for her defense, attended every court hearing, and vowed to continue fighting for what they call justice. To her critics, she's a killer who got away with murder through a clever legal strategy and public manipulation. They see her supporters as gullible, taken in by conspiracy theories and anti-police sentiment. The people at 34 Fairview Road that night have largely retreated from public view. Brian Albert sold the house and moved away. Jennifer McCabe has faced harassment and death threats from Karen Red supporters who believe she's part of the conspiracy. Brian Higgins has maintained his silence throughout. These are people who, regardless of what happened that night, have had their lives completely upended by their connection to this case. John O'Keefe's family remains caught in the middle. They lost a beloved son, brother and uncle in a tragic death. They want answers, they want justice, but the competing narratives have made it nearly impossible to get either. Some family members have publicly supported the prosecution's case and expressed anger at what they see as Karen's efforts to defame John and deflect blame. Others have remained quiet, perhaps unsure what to believe or simply exhausted by the years of legal battles. The truth in the snow, so what really happened on that night in January 2022? After all the trials, all the evidence, all the testimony, can we say with certainty? The honest answer is no, not with complete certainty. That's the frustrating reality of many criminal cases. The truth exists somewhere in the past, but our ability to reconstruct it is imperfect. We have fragments, security footage, phone records, text messages, physical evidence, witness statements. We try to assemble those fragments into a coherent picture, but the fragments don't always fit together neatly, and different people can arrange them into very different pictures. What we can say is this: John O'Keefe died in the snow outside 34 Fairview Road in the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022. His death was tragic and preventable. Whether Karen Red caused his death through impaired driving, whether people inside that house caused his death through violence, or whether the truth involves some combination of factors we haven't fully understood, John deserved better than to die alone in the cold. We can also say that the investigation into his death was deeply flawed. Even if you believe the prosecution's theory, even if you think Karen Red is guilty, the conduct of lead investigator Michael Proctor was inexcusable. His biased texts, his expression of doubt about the case combined with determination to secure a conviction, his admitted mishandling of evidence, all of that compromised the investigation. A case this serious deserved better. John's family deserved better. Karen Reed, whether guilty or innocent, deserved an investigation conducted with integrity. We can say that the connections between investigators and potential witnesses raised legitimate questions about conflicts of interest and whether the investigation was truly independent. In any case, but especially one involving law enforcement officers and their families, extra care should be taken to ensure investigators have no personal stakes in the outcome. That didn't happen here, and the failure to maintain proper boundaries opened the door for conspiracy theories that might have been easily dismissed if the investigation had been handled properly from the start. We can say that the justice system, for all its flaws, worked to some degree. Karen Reed had her day in court, actually multiple days across 2 trials. She had competent legal representation, evidence was examined, witnesses were cross-examined, and juries made their determinations. The fact that the verdicts didn't fully satisfy anyone doesn't mean the system failed. Sometimes justice is messy and incomplete, because the truth itself is messy and incomplete. What we can't say is exactly what happened in those crucial hours. We can't say with certainty whether Karen struck John with her vehicle, or whether he was assaulted inside the house. We can't prove who made that Google search or why. We can't definitively state whether evidence was tampered with, or whether apparent inconsistencies have innocent explanations. These uncertainties will likely never be fully resolved, and people will continue to debate them for years to come. The Watchman. Question. The closing question posed in the outline is perhaps the most important one. When law enforcement investigates itself, who watches the Watchman? This is not a new question. It's been asked throughout history whenever those in power are accused of misconduct. The answer has always been complicated and unsatisfying. We want to believe in oversight mechanisms, in internal affairs divisions, in civilian review boards, in federal investigations. We want to believe that bad actors will be caught and punished, that the system will self-correct. But the Karen Reed case exposes the weaknesses in those mechanisms. Michael Proctor conducted a biased investigation for more than a year before his texts were discovered. The connections between investigators and the Albert household weren't flagged early and addressed. The federal investigation closed without charges despite what many saw as clear evidence of at least misconduct, if not criminal conspiracy. At every level, the oversight that should have caught problems either failed or never materialised. This doesn't necessarily mean there was a massive conspiracy. Oversight mechanisms fail for many reasons. Sometimes it's incompetence rather than corruption. Sometimes it's institutional culture that discourages questioning fellow officers. Sometimes it's just the difficulty of investigating complex cases with limited resources and imperfect information. But the failure of oversight, whatever its cause, has consequences. It erodes public trust. It makes people more susceptible to conspiracy theories. It makes every future case more difficult because witnesses and jurors and the public bring their suspicions and doubts with them. The Karen Red case should prompt serious conversations about how law enforcement investigations are conducted, especially when the investigators have personal or professional connections to the people involved. It should lead to reforms in how evidence is collected, preserved and tracked. It should result in clearer protocols for identifying and managing conflicts of interest. It should spark discussions about independent oversight and accountability. Whether those conversations will happen, whether those reforms will be implemented, remains to be seen. History suggests that real change is difficult and rare. But if John O'Keefe's death can lead to improvements that prevent future miscarriages of justice, whether those future cases involve wrongful convictions or failures to convict the guilty, then something meaningful will have come from this tragedy. The snow remembers. Snow has a quality of preservation. It covers, it conceals, but it also freezes moments in time. When spring comes and the snow melts, what was hidden is revealed. The Karen Red case is like that snow. It covered over questions and contradictions, at least initially. The first narrative, the simple story of a drunk driving accident, seemed to wrap everything up neatly, to freeze the story in a comprehensible form. But as time passed, as the snow metaphorically melted under scrutiny, what was revealed was far more complex and troubling. The simple story gave way to competing narratives, to unanswered questions, to suggestions of conspiracy and corruption. Some of what was revealed might be truth, some might be paranoia, and some might be something in between. What we're left with is not closure, but continued uncertainty. Karen Read is not in prison for murder, but she is not fully exonerated either. John O'Keefe's death is officially resolved in the legal system, but the questions about what really happened remain open in the court of public opinion. The people accused in the conspiracy theory have not been charged, but their names are permanently associated with these allegations. Perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest outcome. Perhaps it reflects the reality that in some cases we simply cannot know the complete truth with certainty. We can have suspicions, we can have beliefs, we can even have legal verdicts, but absolute certainty eludes us. What we can do is learn from the failures exposed by this case. We can demand better investigations, better oversight, better accountability. We can ask harder questions when law enforcement investigates its own. We can be skeptical of both official narratives and conspiracy theories, recognizing that the truth is often more complicated than either extreme suggests. And we can remember John O'Keefe not just as a figure in a controversial case, but as a person. A 16-year veteran officer who dedicated his life to public service. An uncle who stepped up to raise his sister's children when she could no longer care for them. A man who, whatever the circumstances of his death, deserved better than to die alone in the snow, while those who might have helped him either couldn't or wouldn't. The snow that fell on January 29th, 2022 has long since melted. The seasons have changed, the years have passed, but the questions raised that night remain, frozen in the public consciousness, waiting for answers that may never fully come. That's the real tragedy of the Karen Red case. Not just that a man died, though that is tragic enough, but that we may never know with certainty why he died, who is responsible, or whether justice was truly served. When the next snow falls in Canton, Massachusetts, some people will think of that night. They'll think of John O'Keefe, of Karen Reed, of 34 Fairview Road. They'll think of the questions that still hang in the air like snowflakes that never quite settle to the ground. And they'll wonder, as we all wonder, whether the truth is buried somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered, or whether it melted away that morning and can never be recovered. The silence of that snow-covered night keeps its secret still, and in that silence we hear the echo of every unanswered question, every unresolved doubt, every failure of the system we trust to deliver justice. The case of Karen Reed and the death of John O'Keefe is closed in the legal sense, but in every other way that matters, it remains open, a wound that has not healed, a mystery that has not been solved, a story that has not yet found its ending. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps some stories don't get neat endings. Perhaps the only certainty is the snow falling and melting, covering and revealing freezing moments in time, but never quite preserving them completely. And perhaps that's the most honest conclusion we can reach, that we know what happened that night only in fragments, in pieces, in competing versions that can never be fully reconciled. The snow remembers, but it doesn't tell, and so we're left with our questions, our theories, our suspicions and our doubts. We're left with a case that became a symbol, a trial that became a cultural moment, a death that became a debate about trust and truth and justice in America. We're left with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the system we rely on to find answers fails to deliver them. And we're left with the memory of a man who died in the snow, and the woman accused of killing him, and the shadow of doubt that hangs over everything that came after. That shadow is the legacy of this case, not resolution, but uncertainty, not closure, but continued questions, not justice clearly served, but justice debated and disputed and doubted. In the end, that might be the most troubling outcome of all, because if we can't trust the system to find the truth, in a case this scrutinized, this examined, this thoroughly investigated, then when can we trust it? And if we can't answer that question, then the shadow grows longer, the doubt spreads wider, and the next case becomes that much harder to resolve. The snow-cold silence that gave this case its name isn't just about the quiet of that winter night. It's about the silence of unanswered questions, the silence of evidence that doesn't speak clearly, the silence of witnesses who won't or can't tell the complete truth, the silence of investigators who failed in their duty, the silence of a system that couldn't deliver the certainty we expect from justice. And in that silence, John O'Keefe rests, his truth known only to himself and perhaps to those who were there that night. The rest of us are left to wonder, to debate, to take sides in a controversy that may never be fully resolved. That's the real story of the Karen Reed case, not a story with a beginning, middle and clear end, but a story that continues to unfold, to evolve, to challenge our assumptions about truth and justice and the institutions we trust to deliver both. The documentary ends, but the case does not. The questions remain, the silence persists, and somewhere in that silence, buried beneath layers of evidence and testimony and competing narratives, lies the truth. Whether we'll ever uncover it completely is a question that only time, and perhaps new evidence or confessions, can answer. Until then, we're left with what we have, an unsettling case that exposed the fault lines in our justice system and left us all wondering whether we can truly know what happened when those sworn to protect us are the ones under suspicion. The snow has melted, the truth remains frozen,